Now, we change things up a little bit. 25th of February this month, actually, Nigerians will go to the polls to elect a new president. The candidates, Tinabu, Atiku, and some people are saying now they've been, they're converts, obedience. Peter Obi, who will become the next president of Nigeria? Plenty to discuss. But today I want us to just look at the candidates and also democracy as a whole in Nigeria. And joining us today, we have David, I don't want to mispronounce your surname.
Hundeyin.
David Hundeyin. David is a Nigerian investigative journalist and 2023 Distinguished James Curry Fellow at the Center for African Studies, University of Cambridge. And he's also written a book, but we'll get into the book very, very soon. Now, I know you've written an article about one of the candidates, Tinabu, which we'll get into briefly. But before that, I just want us to talk a bit about democracy when it comes to Nigeria, because this election is very crucial for Nigerians. Democracy as a whole and how it has been practiced in Nigeria, because many are saying that this particular election is actually different to previous elections, and I want to know your take on that, your position.
So it is actually different to other elections. It's the 7th election we've had since the return of democracy in 1999. It's the longest single run of democratic leadership that Nigeria has ever experienced in its entire post-colonial history. And it's, to many people, it's perceived as a sort of make or break point. It's an inflection point in Nigeria's democratic history. One of the main things that makes this election differ from the previous ones is the number of realistic candidates in this election. Previously, there's only ever been 2. It's always been this person or that person. It's never really been the case that there are 3 front-running candidates who each have a realistic chance of winning. This is the first time. And even more, from the point of view of a young person in Nigeria, more exciting is the fact that this is possibly the first election in Nigeria's history which, to all intents and purposes, isn't being decided along ethnic and religious lines. For the first time, it's being decided along age lines, along demographic lines, which hasn't happened before. So you have this very sort of interesting situation now where you have, if you've looked at the population bulge that Nigeria has, if you've seen the breakdown of Nigeria's demographic structure, where the median age of Nigeria statistically is about 18.1. It's a very young country. But for the most part, that has never really sort of had any bearing on the voting outcome of elections, right? First of all, the number of registered voters has always been very low compared to the total population. And then the voting turnout on election day has been even much lower. So you have traditionally, in a country of close to 200 million, we've had something like a total of 25 million people deciding the election. This time around, the voters registered swelled to over 80 million. We've had tens of millions of new signups who are almost exclusively from the under 30 age group. And dare I say that the vast majority of those people who have signed up to be fresh voters are voting for something which is outside of the traditional 2 power blocks, the APC and the PDP. And that candidates, whether by providence or by accident, has turned out to be Peter Obi.
Now, you mentioned the fact that Nigeria, in terms of the population, very youthful population, but that in itself doesn't reflect, if you look at the candidates, particularly the 3 candidates who are trying to go for the highest office of the land.
So I don't think this is a specifically Nigerian problem. I think this is an African thing where we are demographically by far the world's youngest continent. The average age across Africa is just under 19. To put that in context, the average age in Asia, the median age in Asia is 33. So we are but the people who happen to be in positions of leadership are 2 or 3 times the median age in Africa. That's the case across the continent. I think that's just amplified more than in other cases in Nigeria, because for a country so young, for its political class to be so old, I've actually argued in the past that there's an argument to be made that it will mean that the system is not actually democratic, because the definition of democracy is a government of the people, for the people, by the people. So if the government does not demographically represent the population that it governs, then can it be said to be democratic? So, but having said that, I think even though you could say that it's basically a 61-year-old running against a 70-something-year-old running against an 80-something or 90-something-year-old, the fact still remains that in the context of Nigeria's post-colonial leadership, a 60-something-year-old democratically elected leader would be a great departure from the norm. It would represent, from the point of view of someone who maybe is used to the political system in the UK, where you have Rishi Sunak, who's like 40-something years old as the prime minister, a 61-year-old head of state doesn't sound like an impressive thing. In Nigeria, it absolutely would be a feat. It would be something impressive, because for the first time, you would have a president who is still very much physically in command of himself, who can still have the physical vitality to actually run a government. And the importance of that would be that for the first time, you would have a presidency that would not essentially be controlled by competing power blocks of people around him, as we've seen over the past few years, where there's this cabal going against that cabal. Then you have one sort of tired old man in the middle who is like spending half his time, jetting off to London for medical treatment. This would be a departure from that. So I think that's, even though in a purely demographic sense, you certainly cannot describe Peter Obi as a youth, but he's definitely much younger than the others. And in terms of what his governance could represent, it would represent something much closer to what the young Nigerian population would hope for than what they've.
I just want to just follow up on what you said earlier, that this particular elections is not about ethnicity or religious affiliation or whatsoever. Why do you think that is? Because in the past, many have argued this is what has actually stopped democracy, quote unquote democracy, from working in Nigeria in particular.
So I should specify that when I said that this election isn't being decided along ethnic and religious lines, I should have specified that the support base for the non-status quo candidate, who is now the front-running candidate, Peter Obi, is the support base which is not based on ethnicity and religion. It's rather based on age. For the other two candidates, specifically for one of the candidates who happens to come from the Southwest, on the other hand, there is still very much a very large ethno-religious bent to it, because I guess that's the only way they know. That's the politics they've been used to. They're too old to change. But the reason I think we were witnessing this shift in political consciousness in Nigeria is manifold. I think it's impossible, it's dishonest to have this conversation without referencing what we saw in 2020, the EndSARS protest movement. Even though I've been very reluctant to draw a straight line from EndSARS to this to this electoral season, but I think it's impossible to not link the two, because first of all, the manner in which the protests were organized, the sort of decentralized, leaderless way they were organized, mirrors very closely the way the Peter Obi campaign has sort of, metamorphosed almost out of nothing and become the front runner, even though there is no structure in place, really. It's just young people. I don't think we had seen that before 2020. So that's definitely an important thing. And I think something else that is also important is that if you look at Nigeria's demographic breakdown, there is a very large, if I'm not mistaken, the largest single demographic in Nigeria is actually under the age of 20. So Nigeria is statistically a very young population. So, and we're going into something called a demographic dividend, where the vast majority of the biggest bulge in the country's demographic structure is within the working age. So we're just about entering that. So there's a large block of voters that have just turned 18 or 19, or they've just come of age over the past 4 years. And these are the voters who were born in the information age, right? Unlike, people like us, who by their standards, we are ancient. We were born in the 90s and 80s. In our time, there was no internet. In our time, we only had things like Nitel. We didn't have GSM. We by their standards, we are ancient. But these so-called Zoomers, the Gen Z, as people call them, the Gen Alphas, who aren't even old enough to vote yet, these people have grown up immersed in internet culture. These people have had access to information, and their way of perceiving the world is markedly different from that which has come before them. So I think that's why we're seeing this sort of shift, and I think it's going to accelerate going even into the next election and the elections beyond.
And I mean, you kind of, take me on to my next question, because your article which you wrote concerning one of the front runners, I mean, he's tipped to become the next president of Nigeria. He's the favorite, right? Tinabu. You wrote an article with his connection with a case of drugs,
heroin trafficking,
trafficking in the US.
Yeah.
And of course, you're talking about the time when this incident took place in the 90s, lack of information, so people weren't aware. We've come forward now, into the 21st century. Before you go into, the story that you wrote about, how have this been received? How has it been received? Are people even bothered about what happened in the 20th century?
Actually, they are. So what I found with the reaction to the story and the documentary, because there was both the written story and the visual documentary made out of it, the reaction has been twofold. So the minority has been sort of older-ish people who are like, this happened, whether or not this happened in 1991. This is ancient history. Why are you resurrecting it? Let bygones be bygones, which I personally think of as a ridiculous position to adopt for something that serious. And then there's been the vast majority of responses have been from younger people in my generation and younger, who are just amazed that, wow, so this sort of thing has been sort of hiding in the open and we simply didn't know. Like, what else don't we know? What other open secret is there lying in some public record somewhere in the US or in the UK or in Europe or in Canada or in Australia that we are not aware of, simply because there is this asymmetry of information that traditionally has existed between the Western world and Africa back when we weren't in the internet age. So those are the two reactions that I've observed.
And a bit more about the story, because I read the article. It is damning. It says a lot, especially if you're looking to attain the highest office of the land. Then this needs to be probed into a bit more. Accountability is something that is a bit of a myth, some might argue, when it comes, particularly across the continent of Africa. Going to this year's election, he's seen as the favorite.
One of the
favorite, I must say. However, this has not really rocked him. Is it a thing, again, I will ask, is it a thing of people saying we don't really care? If that's the case, are people still part of the problem?
So yes and no. First of all, I wouldn't say it hasn't rocked him. It definitely has had an effect. It has definitely had an electoral effect. It is actually part of the research that I'm actually doing on my fellowship at Cambridge is to establish the extent to which so-called new media, independent platforms like mine, have an impact that even established old traditional platforms don't have. And one of the research cases that I'm using is this particular story that I did, because in my observation, obviously this is the scientific observation. This is just like basically word of mouth. This is just a colloquial observation. This is something that it's part of the political lexicon now. People refer to him as a drug dealer. Something which a year ago simply didn't exist, right? People simply weren't aware. This story had that outsized effect. However, going on to what you said about how his electoral chances haven't necessarily evaporated into thin air because of that. That again, you also have to bear in mind that, as I mentioned, this person has a very strong ethno-religious angle to his candidacy. There is regardless of how many Gen Zs are coming up into the voting age, there's still a very large block of voters who don't know what they don't know. Right? They're stuck in the same mentality like they were in 1985. That is all they know. As far as they are concerned, an election in Nigeria is first and foremost an ethno-tribal tussle. So this is someone from my ethnic group, this is someone from my tribe. So if I'm going to vote, that is the voting issue, and I need to make sure that someone from that other tribe doesn't get it. That's all it's about.
And just briefly on the article talks about Tinabu's involvement in drug trafficking, to do with him actually depositing funds, laundering money. Right? I know that people would like to hear more about this. I'm sure they can go onto social media platforms and find out and also watch the documentary. Earlier, during the discussion, I did ask you about the response, the feedback from the article you published. And I just wanted to know, again, from one journalist to another, the feedback you received. You were saying that it was positive, but I wanted to know, is it a thing where, or some of the comments towards you, where your safety is something that you should be worried about?
I mean, so at the time the article was published, I was actually holed up in a safe house. So I guess it's okay to reveal this now. So I guess this is your big exclusive. So most of the past 3 years, my whereabouts have been a mystery, and I have moved around quite a bit. But for much of that time, I was in a safe house in Accra, which was operated by an organization known as WAJSIC. That's the Whistleblowers and Journalists Safety International Council. It's run by a Ghanaian journalist and a good friend of mine called Anas Arameyao Anas. So he actually took me under his protection. So and the Ghanaian government was also really good to me. Which is part of the reason why I'm here today, still alive. So when that particular story was published, at that time I was actually in Ghana. I was actually in a safe house in Ghana already. I was under protection 24/7. So I wasn't unaware of the risks that I was taking. I had already fled Nigeria since November 2020, and shortly after the protest, partly as a result of my involvement in the protest, partly as a result of the work that I had been doing since 2019, and my ticket was already punched. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that if I had stayed maybe another year, I probably wouldn't be here today. If I was in Nigeria right now, I'd probably be dead, quite literally. So my life has been threatened credibly, which is why I was granted asylum to start with. That was established without any shred of doubt. However, I also believe that people only die once. So which is not to say that I'm not afraid. I think it's a human thing to be afraid. But I also think that what makes you extraordinary, if you think of yourself as extraordinary, is that you can work through the fear. You can find a way past it. And if you believe that your mission is bigger than your fear, and you keep doing it anyway, even if you're scared to death, I think that's what will make your work outlive you. That's what will make your work iconic. So that's what I've tried to do over the past 3 to 4 years. So that article definitely did come with risks, and I received all sorts of threats. I received death threats. I was informed, actually. I have no way of verifying this independently, but I was informed that there was a Zoom meeting that was held about me from the camp of who, where plans were made to sort of pay people to track me down and possibly stage an accident. Obviously, I have no way of independently verifying this. This was just what informants brought to me, and I had to take it at face value. But the threats were credible enough for an organization like Forbidden Stories, you might be aware of it, the French organization, to actually reach out to me and take me into their SafeBox network. So the SafeBox network, which I'm part of now, is a network of I think it's over 500 journalists in about 60 over 500 newsrooms across over 60 countries and jurisdictions around the world. So the concept is, if anything happens to a journalist has saved the stuff he's working on the platform via a secure link, and if anything happens to the journalist, then all the journalist's work, which presumably was the reason that journalist got attacked, then gets serialized across all those 60 platforms, across all those 500 newsrooms, across 60 countries and jurisdictions, which sort of takes away the incentive for people to want to do anything to the journalist, because basically by killing the journalist, you're making the story get bigger. So if you go to my Twitter handle, for example, my the banner page it's from the SafeBox network. It says, "Killing the journalist won't kill the story." So that's the background of all of this. So yes, my life has been repeatedly and incredibly threatened. I'm still not home and dry, but regardless, what needs to be done needs to be done.
You said that you're not afraid to die. You only die once, especially if the mission is bigger.
Yeah.
What is your mission?
I think that a large part of the reason why Nigeria and Africa as a whole is in the condition that it's in is not because Africans are worse people than anyone else, but I think it's because there consistently has proven to be an absence of consequences for bad behavior. So people do bad things and they simply suffer no penalties. There are no consequences, not even something as basic as public shame or social censure, nothing. So I think the rational response to that is just to keep doing more of it. I always tell people Nigeria isn't dysfunctional. Nigeria is actually a very functional country. It's working exactly the way it's supposed to work, given the circumstances. Humans are simply responding to conditions, to stimuli. So if you give humans a set of conditions that states that no matter how badly you behave, nothing will happen to you. There will be no consequences. Even something as basic as public exposure and shame, nothing will happen to you. Then that's as good as giving them an incentive to just keep doing that thing, because why shouldn't they? So I think the mission is to establish that baseline that, look, we're not animals here, we're human beings, right? So we're trying to build a modern progressive society. So in such a society, certain types of behaviors cannot be tolerated. In such a society, the person who wants to lead, you know, you can argue from now till tomorrow about whether this person has this scandal or that scandal, or is able to do the job or is not able to do the job, but at least they shouldn't be a drug dealer with a documented history. You know, just those basic things. You know, if someone is running this like a highly valued tech startup, they shouldn't be abusing their position and turning the women into sex slaves, for example. Just really basic stuff, so that maybe the next wave of journalists coming after me, who through the growth of the internet and, you know, the alternative ecosystems, be able to do even bigger work than I have done, who then be able to move on to the next levels of accountability. So I'm basically trying to establish a baseline. If me and a few others who are truly independent, that's what we're trying to do. That's what I think the mission is. And I think that mission is more important than anything else.
I want to talk about your book, The Jungle. What is it about?
So the full title of the book is The Jungle, a personal journey with the enfant terrible of Nigerian journalism. Now, what it is it's essentially an anthology of some of my most sort of seminal work up to date. I developed a reputation back home for writing investigative stories in a non-news format. So they're written as stories. So you can read it as like a crime thriller. It's an actual, factual, journalistic endeavor, but it's not written with 5 Ws and H formats, right? It's written specifically to keep you reading to the end. And my publisher had the idea, brilliant idea. I wasn't the one who came up with the idea, I have to admit. It was my publisher's idea to put combine all of this into a book. Like, these are really good reads, standalone reads. So why don't you just put all of them together, add some commentary, right? And it's a book. And I have to say, you know, even being that I'm the one who wrote the book, when I read it, I still came away feeling like, wow, that was a good read. And I'll also say that, that a fellow you might not know, his name is David Fickling. He's the publisher of DFB Books, which publishes Philip Pullman. So he read my book recently, and he actually sent a message saying, wow, I was shocked by it and I enjoyed it. So that's something that was really good for my ego, I have to say. And I mean, I think if David Pullman's publisher says that the book was good, then I think it's fair to say it's probably good. So yeah.
Well, it'd be great for us to get a copy of your book so we can read it too.
Absolutely. So,
but the fact that you've written such article, I want to know. I mean, you know, from one journalist to another, what kind of feedback, personal feedback, did you get from writing such article?
The overwhelming majority of the reaction was positive, because basically people see it as a public service. You're giving them information that they wouldn't otherwise have had access to, or that other journalists wouldn't go anywhere near, because it's a very risky sort of story to touch. And on the other hand, there's always that tiny minority who believe that the only possible motivation for doing that kind of work is maybe a political rival paid you, or you hate this particular tribe, even though technically we come from the same ethnic group, or, you know, there's always that reaction. So yeah, but, you know, I tend to focus more on the positive. Like, if there are 100 people and 98 of them are saying good things, and then 2 of them are heckling you, I don't think it's sensible to focus on the 2. So.
Absolutely. David, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And to our viewers, listeners, thank you very much for staying tuned. We've come to the end of the show. Hope you enjoyed it, because we certainly did. All being well, we'll see you same place, same time next week. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day.